All right. So now we are onto the assessment of Mill's harm principle. And to remind us, the principle says that um, oops, the principle says that a state can limit the liberty of an individual only insofar this an action causes harms another. Okay. Okay, so we're going to assess it, but first try to understand what that means. So in order to see what that means, we first need a distinction between self-regarding actions and other regarding actions. Okay, so there are actions that affect only the person itself, and there are other, on the other hand, actions that also affect other people. With regard to the self-regarding actions, Mill thinks it's never okay to interfere. So over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. It's only with regard to the other regarding actions, it can be okay to interfere. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. Okay, so this is the only part that we're going to look at insofar as the action affects others. So you might then think one way to read the harm principle is the state has a right to interfere with your liberty insofar as your action has any effect on others. Okay. Now, when we read it this way, though, we're going to find out that very, very, very few actions are going to be, in fact, self-regarding. Almost every action you can think of is going to be other regarding in some way. Why? Because it has some effects on others. You have decided to paint your apartment pink. You may think, well, that doesn't concern any others. That there's a right, the state has no right to tell me what color to paint my apartment. Well, it does, though, affect others. The paint shop who will sell more pink paint. Those factories that produce pink paint will make more money. Those who don't produce pink paint will possibly suffer. Your actions might offend the sensitivities of some of your potential visitors. Some might never come visit you again after that. So it has a lot of effects on others. So if this then would make that action into something where the state has authority to decide for you, interfere with your freedom, limit your freedom to paint the color of your apartment whatever way you like, we would have if that would then there would be a very, very, very limited sphere of individual liberty. The question is, would there really are any actions that are self-regarding? Think about it. Are there really actions that don't have an effect on others? Be creative about it. Think about what actions might they be, and importantly, once you thought about something, try to find think about counterexamples to your example. So think about ways in which maybe this action still does have some effect on others. Okay. Now, problem then is that suppose that the individual had liberty only over genuinely self-regarding actions. And for all other regarding actions, the state is allowed to interfere whenever the costs for society outweigh the benefits. In that case, the sphere of personal liberty would be extremely limited. Okay, so maybe there are some, but it would be very, very limited. For example, you couldn't paint your apartment the way you like. Mill's view is not that view. Mill thinks the sphere of personal liberty is a lot bigger than that. You have a lot more individual freedom than that. And in order to argue for that, he distinguishes between actions that harm others and actions that affect the interests of others only in other ways. So we need a distinction between an effect that an action has by causing harm or harming another person and actions that affect the interests of others in other ways. For example, by offending their sensibilities or by, for example, affecting their economic interests, as in the case of the paint. Note, when we talk here about harming a person, it doesn't mean harming the person's interests. So, for example, someone who buys that cool bicycle that I really want harms my interest to have the bicycle if there's only one on sale in Oslo. It harms my interest. I have an interest in the bike. They have an interest in the bike. They harm that interest by buying the bike before I buy it. But that is not harming them. So we need to now really understand what does it mean to harm someone if that's not just causing them to not get what they want. It's also important for this view that in order to harm someone, we can't mean just actually harm them. Okay? Because if liberty could be restricted only if someone is already actually causing harm, then often it will be too late. Many of the cases where we want the state to interfere would not be cases like that. So this is a camera that's caught Anders Breivik on his way out to Utøya. If that's, I mean, he hasn't done any harm yet. So if the state would not be allowed to interfere at that point, that would be problematic. So Mill thinks that the liberty can be restricted when there is a reasonable expectation of a risk of harm to others. So when we can reasonably expect that this action will cause harm to others, then we can, the state is allowed to interfere. Now, there are going to be difficult questions of exactly how likely does it have to be that there is risk. So when is an expectation reasonable? So these are all interesting questions I want you to think about. But the idea then is where state is allowed to interfere when it's reasonable to expect that the action can cause harm to others. So there's an interesting question then, what Mill, for example, would say about these contemporary restrictions. So I would like to keep all that in mind when we go further in this talk. Okay, so Mill then draws a distinction between affecting someone by just offending them and harming them. But that distinction again is not so easy to draw. So here's some clearly offensive drawings and some that maybe you don't think are very offensive. That depends on probably who you are. The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, his novel, was found offensive by many in the Islamic world. Is that because it caused harm to them? Many people think maybe not. Is it harming you as a Christian to see cartoons like the one in the middle published, or is it harming people of color to have cartoons like the one on the right-hand side be published? So these are offensive, arguably, but are they harmful? That's going to be crucial for Mill, whether the state can interfere in fucking banning such publications. So if they're just offensive, the state has no right to interfere. If they're harmful, then the state has a right to interfere. So we need a distinction between whether we can harm, whether something's causing harm or it's merely offensive. Now note that a reasonable expectation of harm, risk of harm to others is necessary, not sufficient, according to Mill, for restricting someone's liberty. So Mill says, as soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it, so it can interfere. And the question of whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering, it becomes open to discussion. So when it harms others, then the state can interfere. Whether it does so should be calculated as a matter of utility. How much benefit is produced by actually preventing the harm versus how much costs are there by say, outlawing particular kinds of action. Okay. So at this point, I want you to think about cases where maybe an action can clearly reasonably expected to cause harm to others, but where the harm caused by restricting those actions might still be larger, so that the benefits of preventing the first kind of harm is outweighed by the costs of forbidding that action. So these are cases where, yes, this action harms others, but which the state should still not interfere because there's dramatic costs to that. Now, I have, in order to come up with examples here, I'll give you some tools for philosophical thinking. So in order to do this, look for extremes. Here, look for cases where the harm to expect from the action exists. So the action is harming another person, but maybe it's small. But the harm from prohibiting that action, by contrast, may be very big. Or think about cases where the action causes a minor or maybe even middle-sized harm in one case, but the only way we can reasonably prevent this kind of action is by interfering dramatically, also in lots of cases where no harm is caused. Okay, so these are tools. Think about the extreme cases to find cases where maybe the state shouldn't be allowed to interfere according to Mill, even though there's harm caused to another in this case. Okay. In the next video, we'll look at more at what harming actually is according to Mill.